Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the TAPED podcast, the most volcanic podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And joining us once again today, no soon after his appearance on the King Crimson Worst to Best, TreyLikesBands.
Woo!
I'm here again, guys. Totally didn't sneak onto this one, obviously.
We totally didn't drag you onto this one against your will. You're here willingly. Wink, wink.
Of course,
No money has
of
been
course.
exchanged.
Yeah. Please help, please. Oh, no. No, we're good. Yeah, Bjork, yeah.
Yeah, speaking of which, today we're going to be doing a Worst to Best on Icelandic singer, songwriter, and producer, Björk.
Finally.
And we've had this planned for like a year since we actually started the podcast, and I'm very excited to do this one because Björk's discography is, for lack of better words, pretty fucking great. So I'm very excited to rank her work, and we're going to be including the just mainline studio albums from debut to Utopia. We're not going to include any soundtracks, comps, or anything of that sort. And enough waffling. I think we should just get right into it. Starting at our number 8 spot. My number 8 pick is...
Number 9.
Number 9? Number 9?
Number 9.
I know why that happened. My number 9 pick is Volta.
My number 9 pick is also Volta.
My number 9 pick is Utopia.
I know why I said 9, because I didn't include Utopia in my ranking by accident. Don't worry.
Well.
See
Can't blame you. Ooh, sorry.
Oh, yep.
So, we'll just do the normal order, and I chose Volta. Bjork's 2007 album is my least favorite Bjork album, and, that's not an unpopular opinion at all. It's pretty common with fans that, this would be their least favorite record from her, and while I don't think it's a bad or even an average album, it has flaws that hold it back from being higher in my ranking. To start with things that I like about this album, I like that once again, Björk is trying something new and bringing something new to the table, whether that be through the sound or the lyrics. In this case, Volta has some lyrics that are more politically charged on tracks like Earth Intruders and Declare Independence. And, Björk opts to go for a sound that feels more immediate and aggressive with the production, as it feels very hard-hitting and experimental in tone, as well as featuring some co-production from Timbaland of all people. Her incorporation of brass instrumentation on a few of the tamer cuts in this album is a nice touch, and the appearances from AOTY are really great. I think that her chemistry with Björk is pretty good on the track that she's appeared on. And, Björk herself delivers some fantastic vocals on this album as always, and the first 2 songs are legitimately amazing. But I feel like the album just falters after those 2 tracks, because it doesn't really keep up the momentum and only creates problems for itself. That doesn't mean everything is bad past this point. There's only really 1 track that I would say is bad. But the rest just feels poorly executed in its ideas. Structurally, a lot of it is pretty sloppy. I feel like some cuts are drawn out. Sonically, they're kind of thin. And overall, just kind of boring. The brass instrumentation doesn't even leave that much of an impression on me at all. And I suppose there's just some abrasive cuts on this album too that I can't really get into. They feel like a bit of a mess in my opinion, and as a whole, I just don't find these tracks in particular just memorable in the slightest. With that in mind, there's a lot of things to admire about this album, and I get what Björk had in mind for this album, but unfortunately I feel like it doesn't really flesh itself out enough or tries to be significant in her discography.
I also went with Volta, and it's certainly not a bad album, and it's certainly not without some very interesting ideas and experimentation, but a lot of, those ideas and a lot of the experimentation that Björk attempts here just doesn't really stick. It definitely has its powerful, its lush and its intense moments. It wouldn't be a Björk album without those things, but there's just a lot of times here when I'm listening to Volta and I just feel like what I'm hearing is just very awkwardly executed. It doesn't really strike me as anything memorable. It doesn't bleed the emotion and just passion that other Björk albums do, and just as a whole it just doesn't compare to the power of intensity to some of her better works. It's still a decent album. It still has some absolute standouts, but it's definitely the weakest album in her discography, in my opinion at least. And it's a decent album, but by Bjork standards, it's just not great, is it?
Yeah, not really.
Well, for my number 9 pick, I went with Utopia, and a lot of people would probably just like not worry about that because Utopia is her newest album from 2017, and honestly, with me, it's just the fact that it's like long for my liking. It's unmemorable in some parts. It's beautiful. I will say it's definitely pretty. I don't think it's a bad album either. I don't think Bjork is a bad album. I think the lush instrumentals on this thing are absolutely beautiful, and the implementation of like that flute theme throughout is really interesting. I love with every album she has this sort of aesthetic going for her, and for this one, it's like I don't know what to call this aesthetic, like fairies or something. But yeah, but for Utopia, it doesn't really like more than half the track list doesn't really connect with me, and I think that's just because I just don't connect to this type of aesthetic very very much, and it's just really monotonous to me, and there's not much. It's very cohesive, but there's not much difference in the track list for me. But otherwise, Utopia is a pretty alright album. So yeah.
Yeah, I can get that.
Yeah.
Personally, it's not like that monotonous for me, but I can understand that. And yeah, with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Volta are Wanderlust and Earth Invaders. My least favorite track is Declare Independence.
My favorite tracks on Volta are Earth Intruders. Is it Intruders or Invaders?
Invaders, I think. Is it? Or is it Intruders?
It's Intruders. It's Intruders. Okay.
Fuck.
Wanderlust,
I put that wrong in my notes. Fuck.
Vertebrae by Vertebrae, and Pneumonia. My least favorite tracks are The Full Flame of Desire and Declare Independence.
Oh fuck. Well, my favorite tracks on Utopia are Arise in My Senses, Blissing Me, and The Gate. My least favorites are Paradisia, Saint, and Body Memory.
Okay. Moving on to our number 8 picks, I chose Biophilia.
I chose Utopia.
I chose Volta.
Alright. I love the diversity.
Yeah.
2011's Biophilia is an interesting moment in Björk's discography in terms of its concept, and while I think that it's a pretty good album overall, I struggled to get into this album for a few moments. You know, to compliment things about this album, I think that Björk creates an interesting and ambitious concept with the lyrics and sometimes the music even taking an approach towards the natural world. You know, it's basically about nature, the creation of this world that we live in, and sometimes our biology. And the music on this album is very stripped back. It has some really interesting sounds that are arranged and made in a pretty unique way, especially if you do some background research onto this record. Björk doesn't disappoint on the vocal front, obviously. There's some very great moments on this album, and as a whole, it's interesting and experimental from her. But ultimately, there's just a few things that hold this album back for me. I think that the very stripped back nature of this album, while at times really gorgeous, doesn't really keep me engaged. I think that there's some cuts on this album that are pretty tepid and don't really seem that engaging. It's one of her more inaccessible records, and that shows with the sound of this album. And I feel like in the grander scheme of Björk's discography, Biophilia is one of her albums that I honestly wouldn't return to that much over pretty much every other album that I've put above it. And that shouldn't take away from this record, as it is a daring and experimental record that, you know, has some really great songs from Björk, and in general, it's a really good album, but I wouldn't return to it that much, and that's just down to personal preference.
Well, I went with Utopia, and similarly to Volta, I don't think it's a bad album, but it just really pales in comparison to most of what Björk has done throughout her career. You know, vocally, it's as intense and wonderful as always, and Björk just definitely doesn't ever disappoint in that front. But I think the atmosphere of the album and just the whole aesthetic is what kind of bores me. Arca is obviously a very talented producer, but I think their work with Bjork on Vulnerkira is just completely blows this out of the water. I think a lot of the music on Utopia is just a little too skeletal or too overblown. It just feels really thin to me. There's nothing really that's memorable, nothing that interests me all that much. I do appreciate some of the aesthetic. It is, as Trey said, a pretty album, but it's just not very exciting at all. It's not really engaging. It is a bit monotonous. It is a bit one note, and it's just too long as well. It gets boring by the halfway point, and then the rest of the album is just, it drags on, and I just don't see myself coming back to this one very often at all.
So with Volta, like the dude said, Volta y'all, it's a very cool experiment that she tries to go for. I do think it's a little more interesting than Utopia myself. Just in the fact that I connect with more of the songs here. I don't know what it is about the Dull Flame of Desire, but that's literally one of my favorite Bjork songs. I don't know why. I think it's probably the horns and just how warm they sound, and it puts it over the top, that track for me. But overall, the album does feel a little mismatched overall. It's very all over the place when it comes to style. There's not really an aesthetic that goes with this one, I feel. Just like with all Bjork albums, there's this soul aesthetic, this sound. But with this one, I couldn't really pin one down. And maybe it's for that reason that it's low on most people's lists, how it doesn't really solidify itself as, one cohesive project. But there are some really cool experiments on here. And I really like Bjork's vocals here, particularly.
Okay. My favorite tracks from Biophilia are Cosmology, how do I say that again? Fuck. That track, Moon, Thunderbolt, Sacrifice, and Mutual Core. My least favorite tracks are Hollow and Dark Matter. Sorry, I am on a smooth brain day today.
I don't know, Cosmogony, something.
Cosmogony,
I don't know,
something like that.
My favorite tracks on Utopia were Arising My Senses, Blissing Me, Saint. My least favorite tracks were The Gate and Features Creatures.
My favorite tracks on Volta are The Dull Flame of Desire, Earth Intruders, and Declare Independence. My least favorite tracks are I See Who You Are, My Juvenile, and Wanderlust.
Okay. Moving on to our number 7 picks, I chose Utopia.
I chose, and it hurts to put the solo, but I chose Medulla.
I chose Biophilia.
That does indeed sting a little.
Yeah, everything above here is a 7 or above, mind you.
Okay, so I chose Utopia, and it's Bjork's most recent album, which came out in 2017, and even though it is this low on my list, I still think that it's a pretty good album. Like, the gap in quality is pretty narrow when it comes to Bjork albums, in my opinion. Utopia is pretty much a slight continuation on the themes that Bjork explored on Vulnerkira, but to me it's much more of a retrospective on the feelings that went into that record where Bjork is at right now, and I appreciate what she explores on here thematically, even if it doesn't really come off right in some instances. I feel like Bjork vocally, once again, cannot go understated, as she sounds great as always, and and it's just incredible that she's still able to pull off this much vocal prowess even like this late into her career. And what she does on this album is great. She sounds comfortable over this kind of production. And speaking of the production, everything here is co-produced by Arca, who played a role in some tracks on Vulnerkira as well, but on here, she has a lot of creative input into the compositions too, and I think that Arca makes this album all the more interesting with her inclusions, with the very glitchy and hectic sounds that often get explored into the mix. The soundscape of this album is oftentimes very ethereal, somewhat ambient, and natural, with inclusions of these like warped nature sounds, and the flutes on this album in particular are incorporated pretty well into the soundscapes, and they just work to Bjork's advantage throughout this album's duration. Not to mention, it's kind of unique in Bjork's discography, and Utopia has moments where it's just really transcendental and gorgeous. And while I like a lot of the material on this album, I think that it's gets held back mostly because of its length. It's an hour and 11 minutes long, and it's Bjork's longest album, and I feel like it didn't need to be as long as it was. Some tracks could have been cut here and there, particularly ones that aren't all that necessary to the album itself, and possibly the tracks that aren't really all that great. And as a whole, you wouldn't really see me going back to this album in its entirety, or see me in the mood to listen to an album of this length from Bjork. I just feel like her other albums are way more satisfying and convenient to me. But with that in mind, I still think that Utopia is a very good album that has some absolute gems in the track list.
I went with Medulla, which, mind you, is a very good album. And, you know, it's certainly one of the most interesting things that Bjork has ever done. And her emphasis on the human voice in creating a lot of the instrumentals for this album is insanely creative and insanely unique. But aside from the instrumental work, which admittedly is a big reason why I enjoy this project, it doesn't really do much to compare to some of her finer works in any other aspect. You know, it's pretty much impossible for Bjork's songwriting to be bad, but it's nowhere near as poignant or memorable or touching here as it is on something like Vesper Teen or even Post. And, you know, after several listens, the kind of excitement of the acapella instrumentals and the throat singing, everything kind of wanes a little bit, and, you know, the album is still very good, but it's nowhere near as exciting after several listens as it was during my first listen. I still think it's a fantastic album. I just have to put it this low because Bjork is one of my favorite artists of all time, and it's just a testament to just some of the incredible work she's done.
So my number 7 pick was Biophilia, and you know, Biophilia is cool. It's got a really cool aesthetic going for itself with this like natural. Oh, I got a text. This natural vibe, and like with everything that has to do with nature, has to do with the body. It's really cool, and obviously Bjork would do something like this because where she comes from. Iceland is really like nature oriented, so it's really cool to see her like branch out into music that's influenced by the stuff around her. And I think a lot of the tracks on here are really, really cool. Like these ideas, the tracks are cohesive enough to where they're all fit together and they all feel like a unique package. And each track is actually unique itself, pertaining to that overall package. And I think each track contributes really well to this overall aesthetic of nature. And yeah, it's this low in my rankings because just some tracks don't really stand out to me, just personally. But I still think it's a really cool experiment on Bjork's behalf.
Yeah, I can agree with that. It's an interesting experiment, but it doesn't really go that far, honestly. Well, not really that far, but like, it's not that interesting. Well, no, it's interesting, but like, it's not that memorable, I would say.
No, yeah, definitely.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Utopia are Arise in My Senses, The Gate, Utopia, Body Memory, Features Creatures, Lost, Tabula Rasa, Saint, and Future Forever. My least favourite track is Sue Me.
My favourite tracks on Medulla are Pleasure Is All Mine, Where the Line Is, Who Is It, one of my favourite Bjork songs, Desired, Constellation, Mouth's Cradle, and Triumph of a Heart. My least favourite track is Submarine.
My favorite tracks on Biophilia are Mutual Core, Virus, and Crystalline. My least favorites are Sacrifice, Dark Matter, and Solstice.
Okay, moving on to our number 6 picks, and it pains me to put this low, but much like Nostalgia, I went with Medulla.
And once again, it pains me to put this low, but I went with Vulnerkira.
Oh, that actually stings more. Jesus.
Yeah, what the fuck?
What the
Oh,
fuck?
no.
No way.
You're killing me. Well, I put Medulla for my number 6.
Hey, Medulla
I'll
gang.
go last.
Okay. Yeah, Medulla is Bjork's follow-up to Vesper Teen, and to me, this is one of Bjork's most interesting albums in terms of its concept. It's one of her most experimental, and it stands out in her discography for me. Conceptually, Medulla is solely based around the human voice, with instrumentals, if you can even call them instrumentals, based around Bjork's voice, as well as being accompanied by choirs, even getting collaborators that would make this work, like throat singer Tanya Tagak, and even fucking Mike Patton of Faith No More and Mr. Bungle is on this album. And I feel like these collaborators make this album's concept all the more complete and interesting, and it stands out a fair bit in Bjork's discography. Actually, not to mention, I think a few beatboxers appear in this album too, which is fascinating. I think that the sound and composition of this album comes together in a very smooth way. Bjork vocally is still very good and works incredibly well among these obscure voice-based instrumentals. It's very well put together, performed well. As a whole, it's one of Bjork's most realized concepts sound-wise, and it features some outstanding tracks in Bjork's discography. However, I do have a couple of grievances with this album that don't really let me place it any higher than I would like. I think that the shorter interlude type tracks on here aren't all that necessary and don't really add much to the album, despite how interesting and unique this concept is. I don't really see myself, I suppose not really returning to the entire album because of how avant-garde it is. I think the highs on this album are amazing, but I feel like there maybe aren't as amazing as, say, tracks off of Post, Homogenic, Vesper Teen, or even Debut. With that in mind, though, I still think that this is a very good album. I think it's a great album, and it has some of my favourite Bjork tracks on it in general. But I feel like there's just other albums in Bjork's discography that just do a whole lot more for me, and I would return to a whole lot more. But Medulla is a fine album.
I went with Vulnerkira, which again is a fantastic album, and again is just a testament to how good Bjork's discography is. The fact that I have it this low, but I just think she's done better stuff. There's albums that are personally to me more memorable, I connect to more, and just feel more complete. That being said, Vulnerkira is fantastic, and when it comes to breakup albums, it's easily one of the most ambitious and unique of all time. Honestly, the best way to describe it in layman's term is this is the most Bjork breakup album of all time, where a lot of breakup albums are very forward and blunt in their lyrics and emotions. Vulnerkira is very deeply introspective and poetic in its pain and its sorrow, and Bjork's vocals are clearly full of pain, full of sorrow. It's a haunting album, and the production from Arca just adds so much to that. It's way better than what she did on, what was that, Utopia. It's night and day to me. It perfectly matches the beauty, the haunting intensity of the emotion that Bjork portrays with her vocals, and as a whole, it's just one of the most complete albums she's ever made, and one of the most emotionally potent albums she's ever made. So it does pain me to put it this low, but I can't put it any higher, I'm afraid.
That stings, dude. That stings.
That sucks. You gotta reevaluate your life choices.
Sorry, the other albums just contain a bit more fuckage.
Of course. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Medulla are Desired Constellation, Where Is the Line, Vokuro, Who Is I, Sonnets, Unrealities. Is that 9 or 11? I can't tell what. I don't read Roman numerals, but whatever. Ancestors and Mouth's Cradle. My least favourite tracks are Oil Bertan, Submarine, Midvikadags, and Show Me Forgiveness. I'm sorry for butchering so much of this, holy fuck.
My favorite tracks on Medulla are Where Is the Line, Triumph of the Heart, and Pleasure Is All Mine. My least favorites are Submarine and Ancestors.
My favorite tracks on Vulnerkira are Stonemilker, Lion Song, Black Lake, Not Get, and Quicksand. My least favorite track is Mouth Mantra.
Alright. I think this is the point where we're kicking off the top of our list with our number 5 picks. And I chose Debut.
I chose Biophilia.
Oh wow, that's high for that. I chose Debut.
Okay, you can go after me then, Trey, once more. Okay, so Björk's debut solo album is one of her more popular albums among fans. It's the one that propelled her to critical acclaim, and it's easy to see why that's the case, because this album is probably one of the most interesting and creative albums of the early 90s, and while I feel like Bjork would get even more creative and inventive as her career progressed. There's plenty of interesting things to take away from debut. Firstly, right out of the gate, Bjork was expressing her music in an eclectic way, with many tracks here taking inspiration from all over the musical spectrum, like alternative dance, house, art pop, jazz, and trip hop. All of it culminates into a very expressive and intricate album experience, which with equally lush production and intricate production. And while tracks like Crying and Big Time Sensuality come off a little dated in their sounds, they're still pretty great tracks that have admirable qualities about them. I love that a lot. I love a lot of the effective grooves on here, especially on the more house-tinged tracks. I like that Bjork's very open to experimentation on this album. A lot of the soundscapes are very lush, and they accompany the emotion behind Bjork's vocals incredibly well, and all of these come off very calculated and well put together. So Bjork and Nelly Hooper really outdid themselves with a lot of the production on this thing. Of course, Bjork herself is what she does on here cannot go understated. As to put it simply, she's fantastic on this album. She never fails to shine on the vocal front, but here they're just very exciting and youthful. The variety of lyrical themes are written incredibly well on tracks like Venus as a Boy, Human Behavior, the Anchor Song, and Crying. And a few of those songs are just like some of the best in Bjork's discography, some of her most essential, I'd say. I suppose my main gripes with debut were the aforementioned datedness of some of the tracks here and there, and while I love how creative Bjork's sonic direction is on this album, it just feels like Bjork was trying to find her own niche in terms of her sound, and it's not really as adventurous as pretty much every Bjork release past this point. But aside from that, Debut is a great album. It deserves the praise that it gets, and I think that at this point in her discography, it's the best place to start with, I would say. It was the one I technically started in full. So yeah.
Yeah, I think Debut is really great for a debut, and that I'm not going to take that slightly. Debut is filled with so much energy for the young artist at the time. So many of these tracks hit really hard with these house-tinged beats. We got like Human Behavior, Crying, Venus is a Boy. I really like the production tricks on There's More to Life Than This. There's More to Life Than This. There's a lot of really cool details in the production all over this thing. I really like the cohesion of this album, the house tracks mixing with those weird jazz ones like Airplane and the Anchor Song. The coinciding energies that those have is really cool. I think they complement each other very well. And I think Debut is just a really cool album all around, and I'm really glad that we got to hear Bjork do some house, some art pop twinged with house.
I went with Biophilia. I think this album is really quite underrated. Thematically and lyrically, it's a love song to nature and the world around us, which is a fascinating concept that's executed in pretty typical Bjork fashion, full of passion, full of beauty, full of majesty. But it's instrumentally where this album really shines for me. It's one of the most musically exciting and idiosyncratic albums she's ever created. And, you know, the instrumentals on here can be haunting, they can be minimal, they can be serene, they can be dense, they can be harsh, they can be all those things at once. The sheer, like, textures and, like, intensity of everything, the way everything comes together so seamlessly, it's definitely one of her most instrumentally exciting projects. And, you know, it showcases so many ideas, and all of them are so seamlessly intertwined. Everything just works out perfectly when it comes to the production. There are some songwriting moments that, you know, don't really strike me as memorable or don't really excite me as much, but the production is just so consistently good that, for me personally, it carries this album.
Okay. With that in mind, my favourite tracks from Debut are Venus as a Boy, which for me is like a top 3 Bjork song, Human Behavior, One Day Come to Me, and the Anchor Song. My least favourite track is There's More to Life Than This.
Oh god.
Sorry. I'm so sorry.
My favorite tracks on Debut are Human Behavior, the Anchor Song, and Venus as a Boy. and my least favorite is Violently Happy.
My favorite tracks on Biophilia are Moon, Crystalline, Cosmogony, Hollow, and Virus. My least favorite track is Dark Matter.
Okay, moving on to our number 4 picks. I chose Vulnerkira.
This is where we get into the quote-unquote real shit. I chose Homogenic.
Okay.
Wow.
It's a little low for me. It's kind of... Oh. Okay.
It wouldn't be a taped podcast without nostalgia hot takes. Or odd takes, I would say.
I mean, it's not... I mean, you still think it's real shit, but man...
Oh, it's real shit.
Yeah.
It's an odd place. We're just going to call this the odd nostalgia power hour, maybe.
My 4th pick is Post.
Okay. Okay. Okay, with that, I'll just start talking about Vulnerkira now before I start whatever. Yeah, Vulnerkira. Bjork's 2014. Yeah, Vulnerkira is an amazing album that to me stands out in her discography as her at her most vulnerable and emotional. It was a moment that saw her get very intimate about her breakup with former partner Matthew Barney, and it comes off like a very raw and potent look at a breakup. It's one of the most unique breakup albums ever made, I would say. In terms of production, Vulnerkira is an experimental art in the experimental art pop lane that focused on a pretty interesting yet stark atmosphere that matched the incredibly dark and heartbreaking tone of what Bjork was doing on the vocals and the lyrics. She got co-production from the Haxon, Cloak and Arca, who helped Bjork in creating such a sparse yet dissonant atmosphere while also providing their own unique and experimental styles to the tracks, which they do with interesting results and amazing moments of sound. You know, some of Bjork's longest songs are on this album as well, and where the longer moments lacked on, say, Volta, they work incredibly well on Vulnerkira as it provides such an interesting depth to the tracks that they come off like they're pretty well fleshed out, and they support what Bjork is doing incredibly well, and they just add to the emotion of the lyrics and the performances. Of course, this album wouldn't be what it is without Bjork, as her lyrics and vocals are very dark. Bjork is dealing with a lot of pain, anger, and sadness on this album after the aforementioned breakup, and it's such a cold yet gorgeous piece of dark poetry that reflects Bjork's feelings in such a potent way. AOTY makes another appearance on a Bjork track, and I feel like she adds to her track pretty well, and there's genuinely some amazing moments on this album that are honestly some of her best songs. I suppose what puts it in this spot and not higher is the fact that the other 3 albums that I put above it are ones that I genuinely adore, and I couldn't bring myself to put Vulnerkira higher than them. I do feel like the last couple of tracks in the album aren't as good as the first 5 tracks. They feel a little more lackluster, and I don't know, I guess the way that the last track like abruptly ends is a bit jarring. But besides that, Vulnerkira is an amazing album that for sure has some amazing standouts, and it's probably one of the most unique albums in Bjork's discography.
I agree with that.
This is getting really tricky, and as much as it pains me to put what is probably Bjork's most iconic album at number 4, I just personally love everything I've ranked above it just a tiny bit more. That being said, this album is absolutely beautiful, and as much as that word might lose its meaning when I'm talking about Bjork, because a lot of her music is very, very beautiful, this one is just the one that stands out to me as just one of the most serene and just overall beautiful albums, just straight up beautiful. It's a very cold and very distant album. It's not really colorful. It almost feels like a soundtrack to being alone in an Arctic tundra. But Bjork's just incredible, breathtaking vocals and the fantastic instrumentation and strings just add so much light and so much clarity to the music. It's an album that aesthetically and atmospherically is very unique in Bjork's discography for me personally. And just every single second of this album flows so perfectly. It's so majestic, it's just so grandiose. And it's an incredible album, and again, the fact that it's number 4 is just a testament to how much I love Bjork. Rarely when I put, these albums lower down the rankings, is it a matter of me not enjoying this album. It's just a matter of me kind of having some less popular favorites, let's put it that way. But I adore this album. It's one of the best albums ever made in my opinion. But it's my number 4 pick, unfortunately.
Shame.
Sadness.
Sad.
So probably on to more shame here. My number 4 pick was Post. I don't know if it's like low.
It's pretty low.
I mean, enough, I'd say.
I mean, I still love this thing. Post is fucking gorgeous. It's literally her sophomore album is like this good. Like what? She's a musical genius. I'm literally gonna say it. I don't care. This album is just so cohesive. It's so hard hitting at every single point. There's not a bad track, I don't think. And I think it's really a really great. Just like I don't know what to say about this thing that hasn't already been said. Honestly, it's really important. It's super cool, and yeah, I'm gonna stop babbling because I don't want to go on for too long.
Okay, my favorite tracks from Vulnerkira are Stone Milker, Black Lake, Lion Song, History of Touches, and Mouth Mantra. My least favorite track is Atom Dance.
My favorite tracks on Homogenic were Hunter, Yoga, Unravel, Bachelorette, All Neon Like, 5 Years, Alarm Call, and Pluto. My least favorite track, if I had to pick, would be Immature.
My favorite tracks on Post are It's So Quiet, Army of Me, and Isobel. And my least favorite is Cover Me.
Alright, we're in the top 3 now, and fuck me, this was so hard to pick. To rank these. Jesus Christ. Ugh. Okay, look, it pains me to put this album in particular at this number 3 spot, but I have to. I chose Post.
This also pains me. I chose Vesper Teen.
Oh.
Whoa.
God.
What? I'm trying to think of what you haven't. Okay. Anyway, my number 3 is Vulnerkira.
All right. So, yeah, Bjork's sophomore album Post is in many ways similar to her debut, but to me, Post only saw Bjork vastly improve upon the influences of her debut, expand upon them with something that was just more intriguing, and just turn it up by 10. And as a result, we get an amazing record from her that is near perfect for me and easily ranks as one of her absolute best albums. The first half of the album was the first thing that I ever got to listen to ever from Bjork, thanks to nostalgia, but I never got to finish it, and since I finally got to listen to this album in full, I was so mad at myself because it was just so fucking good, and I wish I finished it the first time. It's honestly an incredible record, and it's incredible for a number of reasons. The combination of electronics, trip-hop, art-pop remain just as versatile and as interesting as they were on debut, but on Post they're just all the more forward-thinking, engaging, and realised on this album, especially given how incredibly memorable, hard-hitting, potent, timeless, and consistent this album is, from its production to Bjork's vocals and songwriting. The production on this album is incredible. The soundscape of this thing just sounds all the more beefy and huge, and especially with the trip-hop tracks on this thing. And I also like the subtle nod towards being industrial, as well as the transcendental ballads that we all know and love Bjork for, like Isobel and Hyper Ballad. And the very gorgeous and serene moments like You've Been Flirting Again and Cover Me are just amazing. like the sound palette on this thing is just so large and invented that it comes off like it's futuristic in a sense, and just Bjork indeed shows that she wanted to take us to the future as soon as possible because it was that amazing to hear. Bjork's vocals on this album are fantastic once again. I love how commanding and attention demanding her vocals are in this album. They have this sort of power to them that no Bjork release has really given, honestly. They're not as wild or as gorgeous as you'd normally expect them to be, but, well, maybe on a few tracks, but it's just something about her delivery that just makes this album all the more captivating. Some of my favorite Bjork songs ever are on this album too. Army of Me, Hyper Ballad, Isabel, Possibly Maybe, Enjoy, and It's Oh So Quiet. The last of those tracks give me such a fucking adrenaline rush that it's insane. And whenever I listen to like her cover of the jazz standard It's Oh So Quiet, I just have such a hard time containing myself because it's just so fun and infectious. It's honestly one of the best covers like ever. Yeah. And just to summarize my thoughts, I love it. When I first heard this album in full, I was honestly the most excited I'd ever been listening to an album in a good while. Some of Bjork's best tracks ever are on this album. Some of my personal favorite tracks from her are on this album. I love the production. I love everything about Post. Yeah, it's amazing. What more is there to say?
Agreed.
I went with Vesper Teen, and this is one of those albums that is just so beautiful and mind-blowing that it's hard for me to even describe my emotions towards it. It's just such an intense album, but in the most serene and just beautiful and peaceful way possible. It effortlessly presents some of the most alluring and just transcendental soundscape music has to offer. It's just it's a masterpiece, honestly. I'm lost for words. I actually physically don't know how to talk about this album. It's just an experience. That's all I can say. It is such an experience. Production wise, it's so well crafted and put together. Everything just sounds so like perfectly in place. Bjork's vocals flow like one of the instruments. It's one of her most vocally impressive albums, and that's saying something because Bjork is personally my favorite vocalist of all time. It's peak music, honestly. That being said, it's still number 3.
What? So my number 3 is actually Vulnerkira. If I were to ever listen to a breakup album, this would be the one I'd go to most of all, because it shows real pain in the instrumentals. It shows real pain in the vocals. It's not just some, subtle little thing like, oh, I'm sorry, take me back. No, this is heartbreaking, this thing. You got tracks such as Stone Milker and Black Lake, which absolutely take like this really dark turn and are like, I wonder how Bjork fans in 2015 just turned on the album and just like were like, oh crap. Yeah, because this thing is really dark and like, I don't know. I think I love it a lot. I think. Why did I say I think? I love this thing a lot.
You're unsure of yourself.
I'm really unsure, guys. No, Vulnerkira is just absolutely breathtaking, and a lot of the moments on here do seem a little unmemorable, but I never really return to just one track on here. It's always the whole experience is better than just the parts. So yeah, Vulnerkira, number 3, amazing album.
Hard agree. My favorite tracks from Post are Hyper Ballad, Army of Me, It's Oh So Quiet, Enjoy, You've Been Flirting Again, Isabel, Possibly Maybe, Cover Me, and Headphones. I have no least favorite tracks. This album's amazing. It's near perfect.
My favorite tracks on Vesper Teen are Hidden Place, Cocoon, It's Not Up to You, Undo, Pagan Poetry, obviously, Aurora, Sun in My Mouth, Heirloom, Arm of Will, and Unison. I really don't have a least favorite track. If I had to pick, I'd go for an Echo Stain, which is still a good track, but what can you do?
Exactly.
My favorite tracks on Vulnerkira are Black Lake, Stone Milker, and Not Get. My least favorite is Quicksand, but that was really hard to pick.
This next pick was especially hard because, like, fuck me, dude. Like,
dude,
I have both of these albums at a 10. Like, what do you want me to do?
Wow.
Like,
okay.
Damn, what do you want me to do? My number 2 pick is Homogenic.
My number 2 pick is Debut. Think of that one.
I know you mentioned that you think it's fucking underrated, but like, damn.
That's awesome.
Honestly, I mean, if you look at Rate Your Music, I think it's her third highest ranked album, so I wasn't expecting it. No, fourth, sorry.
No, it's her fifth. It's her fifth.
So I was kind of surprised that, but I don't know. I'm not that surprised also at the same time.
Well, I mean, like, I'm still surprised, but like over Homogenic and Vesper Teen?
Yeah.
Really?
Yep.
Damn.
Always has been, to be honest.
Well, to follow that up, my second favorite is Vesper Teen.
I can forgive that, though. I can forgive that.
Now, do the rest of the rankings kind of make more sense? Why everything seems a little pushed back?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Homogenic is often considered one of her best records to critics and fans, and while I don't necessarily agree with them fully, I could certainly understand why, and I was so tempted to put it at the top of my list, but I just couldn't, man. But with that in mind, though, I adore Homogenic, and honestly, it's one of the best albums ever to have been made in the 90s. It's certainly one of the best electronic albums of the 90s, anyway. Like, I feel like everything that Bjork was doing in the 90s up to this point was building up to this album, and in my opinion, this is basically the culmination of that, as the sound of this album is pretty similar in vein to Bjork's electronic side of her sound on debut and post, with lots of influences from alternative dance and trip-hop still being present, but what makes this dissimilar in her discography at this point was the inclusions of more like IDM fusions and atmospheres, as well as string arrangements to give it a larger sound, and my god, did it play to her strengths, because it's just, the result is truly phenomenal. I said that post had to be her most forward-thinking vision, but here, like, this record literally sounds like the future, and it still does to this day even. Like, it's aged that gracefully, and I love how intricate and calculated everything on this album feels. The production on this album is fantastic. The large sound of this thing is emphasized by the incredible sounding electronics and strings that are just so transcendental, consistently transcendental, might I add. And like I said, it has aged like fine fucking wine. I love a lot of the more aggressive sounding songs in this album as well. I feel like Bjork finds a fine balance between the gorgeous electronic ballads and the blood pumping bangers. Bjork herself gives some of her best vocal performances ever on some of these tracks, like on Yoga, Unravel, Bachelorette, 5 Years, Immature, All Is Full of Love, and that's just to name a few. I love how dramatic and theatrical they are on this album. Some of her lyrics come off as some of her best too. Some of her most potent and emotional sets of them turn up on this album. And the way that Bjork like sings kind of propels these songs into a more dramatic life, that it works so well for the sound. You know, I'd say to summarize Homogenic, I'd say it's the definitive Bjork record, in my opinion. I feel like this is one that defined her musical identity going forward, and it truly is a phenomenal record for the art pop genre. It's smartly written, well put together, performed amazingly, and it sounds godly. I wish I could put it at the top, but there's just one record that I love a teeny bit more.
Yeah, I went with debut.
Explain yourself.
Bjork's career has just been so full of innovation and abstract ideas that it makes her debut seem a little, dare I say, accessible, and a little, dare I say, tame. But keeping in mind that this is the first step in her solo career, the album she released when she was 13 does not count, and remembering that this album is almost 30 years old, really puts into perspective just how ahead of the time, how exciting, and just how fresh this project is. And in my opinion, it's aged perfectly. It still sounds incredible. It does feel like a little bit of a normie pick. It is kind of accessible in comparison to stuff like Vulnerkira or Vesper Teen. But you know, I'm not ashamed that I'm quite a poptimist, and this is just one of the most colorful, exciting, fun projects I've ever heard. It's one of my favorite pop albums of all time, period, and I just gravitate towards this project so much. Every track on here is just wonderful, and I can kind of see why, you know, it wouldn't make its way high up most people's rankings, but just to me, like, everything here just clicks perfectly. I've always loved this album. As far back as I remember, this has been one of my favorite projects from her. It's just addicting. I love every second of it. I come back to it, honestly, more often than any other Bjork album, bar one. I mean, I can't really explain how much I love this album. I can't really explain why I love this album so much. I do think it perfectly fuses house with trip hop, with pop, with alternative dance. It just does everything so fluently, and again, for a debut, that's just so mind-blowing to me. I just adore this project to death. Like, I love it to death. Like, Trey can go, and I'm done.
You made some good points.
How dare you like an album?
Yeah, come on, man. So my number 2 is Vesper Teen, and what can I say about this thing that hasn't already been said? Vesper Teen is one of the best albums of all time, and for good reason. The instrumentals in here are very cocooned, very ambient, very glitchy. This album's super cohesive. I mean, the energy put forth on this entire release is just so potent, and I really don't know what to say about this thing because so many people have already went on about it, and I do think it's really, really great. That's it. Yeah.
I can understand that. My favorite tracks from Homogenic, I think all of them. I love all of these tracks, but if I had to pick specific ones, Hunter, Yoga, Unravel, Bachelorette, 5 Years, Immature, Alarm Call, and All Is Full of Love. I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks are all of them, to be honest. I will say There's More to Life Than This is my favorite Bjork song.
Wow.
It's so good. It's so damn good.
Yeah.
But I don't have any least favorite tracks either. I'm gonna do this for the number 1 album as well, so just a heads up.
Okay.
It was hard to pick favorites and least favorites for Vesper Teen, but my favorites are Pagan Poetry, Hidden Place, and Cocoon. My least favorite, it just had to go to Sun in My Mouth.
Stings. So yeah, with that in mind, my number 1 pick is Vesper Teen.
My number 1 pick is Post.
My number 1 is Homogenic.
Damn. No overlap.
I have to say, I like how diverse our rankings have been, like, throughout the whole podcast.
Very different from the King Crimson one, where Nostalgia and I were just twinning.
Pretty much. Vesper Teen, in my humble opinion, is Björk's best album in almost every way to me. It's honestly one of the most gratifying and gorgeous albums I've ever heard, and in the grander scheme of Björk's discography, it stands out to me as Björk at her most consistent absolute A game. I bought Vesper Teen on vinyl without even hearing the album. It was the first time I ever did that, except I think when Nostalgia loaned me Bitches Brew, even though I only got that for a loan. And when I first heard Vesper Teen for the first time, it was just a whole other experience. One of the most amazing album experiences I've had, and I'm so glad that my first listen ever to this record was on vinyl because it was just amazing. Björk is pretty much known for making albums that have a gargantuan sound to them, and they vary in what they attempt as well, but in Vesper Teen's case, it's just so otherworldly, while at the same time sounding so fresh from anything in her discography. It carries over a lot of sounds from Homogenic, like her trademark electronics and synths, as well as the strings that she incorporated on Homogenic, and the unique rhythms packed into a more refined, subtle, somewhat ambient, and dynamic sound palette that is just mind-blowing, to say the least. And the way she incorporates all of these gorgeous sounds is so seamless. I love the organic qualities that Björk emphasizes with this record, and as a result, she ends up making some of her best music ever. The album sounds consistently beautiful throughout its entire tracklist, and you can tell that there was so much drive and passion put into this album, given the subtle nuances that you can find with more listens. Björk, of course, doesn't fail on the vocal front, as she gives some of her best vocals ever laid to tape, some of her most like emotive, powerful, and transcendental moments. They complement the wide and beautiful sound of this thing effortlessly, and it makes the experience itself all the more gratifying to me. Like, legit, Bjork is one of the best vocalists of all time, hands down. I agree with you there, Nostalgia. You know, Bjork is also delivering a lot of the sensual poetry that was inspired by her relationship with her then partner, and I feel like a lot of what is being said on this album only really adds to the album's beauty, despite what happened between their relationship since then. You know, the track list itself is pretty flawless in my opinion. I love every track on this thing. I love what Bjork presented us with, some of which are my favorite Bjork songs like ever. Some of her most transcendental and otherworldly tracks are on this album. It's just so damn pretty, and I want to just get up right now, stop the podcast, and listen to the album again. It's just that good. So yeah, with that in mind, I love Vesper Teen. It's the best of Bjork's catalogue in my opinion. I love her other albums too, but Vesper Teen just does so much more for me. It's a perfect album in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, ranking the top 4 was a hard task to say the least, but Post just always stood out to me as, you know, for me personally, the Bjork album. It feels like a transition period between the fun and danceable sound of debut and the poignant, grand, and serene sound of Homogenic. It kind of rides the wave between those two albums perfectly, and, you know, it's no secret that I love both of those projects, and so, you know, there's nothing about Post that isn't there. There's nothing about Post that I wouldn't like. It's just, to me, her best produced album. To me, vocally, it's her most impressive album. The songwriting here is just so memorable. It's fun, it's catchy, it's incredibly emotional when it needs to be. It's incredibly poignant and memorable when it needs to be. It does have a lot of those bright and colorful, like, fun tendencies that I love about debut, but it doesn't feel as carefree. It doesn't feel as in your face. It feels a lot more calculated, more subtle, and more mature. And, you know, in its experimentation, it's definitely not quite as mellow, quite as, you know, out there as something like Vesper Teen. But, you know, it still brings so many fresh new ideas to the table. And I think it's just, I mean, the trip hop sound is just something that, for me personally, works wonderfully with Bjork's music. And, you know, it's obviously no secret now that kind of era of Bjork is my favorite era of Bjork. And Post is definitely the defining album of the two. As much as I love debut, it just doesn't have a weak track. Every single track here is incredible, and it's a 10, to be honest. I had it at like so close to a 10 for like 3 years, but I'm saying it now. It's a 10.
Let's go. That's great. Homogenic. Okay, let's talk about this. So it was the first Bjork album I had ever heard. So let me paint the picture for you. I think it was like 2016, 2017 or something. I was on a cruise for my grandpa's 80th birthday. It sucked. I hate cruises now. It was horrible. But I listened to an album on the cruise that I had never heard before that my uncle showed me, and it was Homogenic. And that instantly made the experience 10 times better. Homogenic is one of my favorite albums of all time. It creates this super visceral atmosphere. In just the first track, you're plunged into this icy production, and like this really mysterious delivery from Bjork. Her vocals on this album are absolutely spectacular. She is one of the best vocalists of all time, Mickey. I do agree with you.
Yes.
And this album's just so cohesive in the way it like presents its ideas. All of the tracks really contribute to the whole. I also have a hard time talking about this one, just as Vesper Teen, because it's already at that masterpiece level that you can't really talk about anything negatively, and all the positive things are just so overwhelming. So I'll keep it at Homogenic, my favorite Bjork album, one of my favorite albums of all time, hands down.
Nice.
Based uncle.
Based uncle. All right, my favorite tracks from Vesper Teen. I think all of them are perfect, but I've just chosen a select few to be my favourites. I've chose Hidden Place, Cocoon, It's Not Up to You, which is probably my favourite Bjork song, Undo, Pagan Poetry, Aurora, Sun in My Mouth, and Harm of Will. I have no least favourite tracks. Perfect album.
Your select few is almost the full. God, I mean, right, I'll try to do a select few for post because I kind of did all of them again. Army of Me, Hyper Ballad, The Modern Things, It's So Quiet, Enjoy, Isabel, Possibly Maybe, I Miss You, and Headphones.
And what's your least favorite song?
Probably Cover Me, but that song is great.
Proceeds to pick the entire post track list.
No, I didn't. It Cover Me.
Select few, yes.
So if I were to narrow it down to my favorites, I'd go with Bachelorette, Hunter, Yoga, Unravel, All This Full of Love, and Pluto. And my least favorite, I don't know. I'm not going to pick a least favorite. You know what? No. This album's amazing.
Screw least favorites, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, we did it. We ranked all of Bjork's albums. Woo!
Woo!
Give yourselves a clap there, lads.
Oh.
Trey, thanks again for coming on. We really appreciate that. It was great to actually get you on for this one.
Thank you guys for having me. I love talking about this kind of shit, so anytime.
Thanks
for getting up really early for us.
Yeah. Speaking of any time, Mick is in the next worst to best. After a short break, gonna be with Trey again.
Yes.
Wait,
yes.
Yeah. We're taking a short break in between. We're gonna have a recap next week, but the next worst to best after that will be a little prog rock band from Canada.
Oh yes, and that band themselves. They may have one of the greatest drummers of all time, one of the greatest guitarists of all time, one of the greatest bassists of all time. It's Rush. We're doing Rush. Okay, it's Rush.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's the next on the calendar.
Yeah, but you won't be getting to see that until after a week-long break, which we're doing after our next recap.
So in 2 weeks or so.
Basically. Basically like 2 weeks. Just keep that in mind. And then, actually, another... will I just announce what the next worst best after that then? Because what the hell not?
Sure, yeah. We're going to be updating calendar.
Yeah, we're going to be doing an Outcast worst to best after Rush. So you should definitely be looking out for what's coming in April. And yeah, with that in mind, thanks for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed. Links to Trey's YouTube and Rate Your Music will be in the description, as well as me and Nostalgia's individual channels and our Rate Your Music and Album of the Year pages, and our Twitter as well. I really should be using the Twitter more often. And with that in mind, my name's MickyT.
I'm Nostalgia.
I'm Trey.
See ya!
Bye-bye.